In the interior of the state of Texas, where the horizon stretched in straight lines and the sky always seemed larger than any human concern, there was a plot of almost 40 hectares that had remained untouched for decades. The land did not attract attention. There was no lake, no centuries-old trees, no sign of immediate wealth. Still, that piece of ground had a rightful owner, someone who never needed to be present to know it existed. Ethan Miller inherited the land from his father at a young age. At the time, he was working as an industrial maintenance technician in Houston and barely had time to think about inheritances or farmland. His father, a quiet and meticulous man, had always said that this land was not to be sold in a hurry. "Put it away. One day you will understand," he repeated. Ethan saved it. He paid taxes, kept the deed in order, and moved on with his life, believing that this dormant asset would remain exactly as it was for many years. On the other side of the neighboring city, however, urban growth was advancing without asking for permission. The demand for housing was increasing, families were looking for affordable homes, and builders were vying for every available square meter. A local company, supported by community leaders and regional investors, announced a major housing project. 88 affordable homes, aimed at workers, young couples and retirees who could no longer afford inflated real estate prices. The announcement was celebrated. Local newspapers praised the initiative. Officials praised the social impact. The community, in need of good news, embraced the idea as a symbol of progress. The problem is that no one bothered to confirm, in an adequate way, who was the real owner of the land chosen for the project. The first signs appeared unobtrusively. A notice of change in the amount of land tax arrived at Ethan's house. The increase was significant. He wondered, but attributed it to a common reassessment. Without imagining what was really happening, he paid the adjusted amount and went about his routine. Months later, a colleague casually commented on a new neighborhood under development near the old state road. He said houses were being erected quickly, that the project seemed organized, and that, finally, the region was growing. The comment did not arouse immediate suspicion until the name of the place was mentioned. It was the same ground. Ethan didn't react with fury. He didn't run to a lawyer. He didn't make desperate calls. First, drove there. What he saw was impossible to ignore. Heavy machinery, foundations ready, walls rising, streets being paved. Signs heralded the future neighborhood as a beacon of hope. Workers moved around naturally, as if that land had always belonged to that project. None of them knew who Ethan was. No one imagined that the man standing by the side of the road, watching in silence, was the rightful owner of it all. The contrast was evident. On the one hand, an entire community investing dreams, money, and expectation. On the other, a lone man, holding old documents, silent evidence of a right that no one seemed to recognize. Ethan felt the weight of the situation, but also something deeper, clarity. He knew he could stop everything there. All that was needed was a court order, a formal notification. Construction would cease, headlines would change tone, and dozens of families would be left without answers. But he didn't do that. He returned home, organized his documents, and made a decision that no one around him understood. He would allow construction to continue. Not out of weakness, not out of inattention, but because he understood that the conflict was not just legal. It was human. As the bricks piled up and the roofs took shape, Ethan prepared in silence. Every tax receipt paid, every record ignored by local authorities, every bureaucratic mistake made by those responsible for the project was carefully catalogued. Doubt hung in the air. Why did he wait? The answer was not yet visible, but it was in motion. And when it came to light, it would change the fate of everyone involved, not by force, but by justice. Over the weeks, Ethan's plot ceased to be just a construction site and began to turn into something alive. Streets were given names, streetlights were installed, and small signs appeared indicating numbered lots. What was once a quiet space now pulsed with the constant sound of hammers, trucks, and lively conversations. The region, once forgotten by the government, had become a symbol of opportunity. Those responsible for the project formed a heterogeneous group. At the helm was Richard Coleman, a real estate developer known for quick projects and efficient solutions. He was not a cruel man, but he was not careful either. He relied too much on summary reports, delegated legal checks to third parties, and believed that if something was wrong, someone would have already pointed it out. For him, that land was just another item on a SP read sheet. There was also the community council, formed by former residents of the city. Ordinary people with good intentions, who saw in that neighborhood a chance to keep children and grandchildren around. Many attended public meetings, fundraisers, and local events to support the project. For them, questioning the legality of the land never crossed their minds. The initial approval of the authorities seemed sufficient guarantee. Prominent among the prospective residents was Maria Thompson, a nurse and solo mother of two, who had saved for years to get into one of the homes. She visited the work whenever she could, watching the progress with a mixture of anxiety and hope. Each wall erected represented stability, something his life had always lacked. Ethan watched from a distance. He didn't show up at the events, he didn't argue with the workers, he didn't confront anyone. During the day, he went about his normal routine in Houston. In the evenings, he studied documents, old maps, county records. It found that the failure had begun years earlier, when a digital cataloging error had confused territorial boundaries. From there, a sequence of assumptions replaced formal checks. He also realized something important. No one was acting in deliberate bad faith. The error was systemic, the fruit of haste, overconfidence, and the common belief that if it's happening, it must be right. Still, the impact was real. As the houses neared completion, human stories connected to that place emerged. Couples took pictures in front of the future doors. Children ran along the newly concreted sidewalks. Small gardens began to be planned even before the official handing over of the keys. Ethan felt the weight of these images, not as guilt, but as responsibility. His father had always said that property was not just possession, it was care. And caring, sometimes, meant choosing the right time to act. He decided to approach unobtrusively. He hired a lawyer specializing in real estate law and submitted all the documentation. The professional was surprised by the clarity of the records. There was no doubt. Legally, the land was Ethan's, from the first to the last square meter. The recommendation was straightforward: act immediately. Ethan refused. He asked for something different. He wanted to understand all the possible consequences, not only for him, but for those who had already invested their lives there. The lawyer, though skeptical, agreed to tread cautiously. They filed preemptive, silent notices ensuring Ethan's right was not time-barred. Nothing that would interrupt the works, but everything that would create a solid legal trail. Meanwhile, the neighborhood gained definite shape. The name was made official. The 88 houses were practically ready. Local media prepared optimistic reports. The city prided itself on its growth. Ethan knew that the decisive moment was approaching. He walked around the place again, now almost unrecognizable. He stopped in front of one of the houses, simple, well-built, with a small veranda. He imagined families in there, routines being created, lives happening. He felt no anger. He felt determination. The story had not yet reached open conflict, but all the pieces were in place. The initial mistake, the good intentions, the bureaucratic negligence, and the silent right converged to an inevitable point. The question was no longer whether something would happen, but how. And Ethan was ready to ensure that when the truth came out, it would not destroy, but transform. The apparent lull began to break as the project entered its final phase. The houses were ready, only details remained: exterior painting, installation of fences, infrastructure testing. The mood was one of early celebration, but behind the scenes, small tensions began to emerge. The first signal came from a county office. A newly hired employee, when reviewing old files for cadastral updating, noticed an inconsistency in the records of the land plot where the new quarter had been built. The name of the owner did not correspond to that of the company responsible for the development. Initially, the discrepancy was treated as a minor error, something to be adjusted after the official unveiling. But the official insisted, referred the case for legal review. At the same time, Ethan took the next step. His lawyer formally filed an action for recognition of ownership, attaching decades of records, proof of payment of taxes, and the original deed. The order did not call for immediate eviction or cessation of activities, but it made it clear the land had an owner, and that owner had never authorized any construction. The notification has arrived. To the builder as a silent shock. Richard Coleman received the documents in his living room, read them twice, and felt the weight of his own negligence. He knew that something had been done in a hurry, but he had never imagined that the mistake was so serious. He tried to contact those responsible for the initial verification, but found only evasive answers and contracts full of generic clauses. Quickly, the matter moved out of the offices and into the emergency meetings. Lawyers, investors, and representatives of the city council began to discuss responsibilities. Each side tried to protect its own image. No one wanted to be blamed for a mistake that put 88 families at risk. The news began to circulate in a fragmented way. A rumor here, another there. Residents waiting for the keys heard confused comments about legal issues. Maria Thompson noticed the change in the environment when a visit to the construction site was canceled without clear explanations. Joy gave way to insecurity. Meanwhile, Ethan kept his low-key stance. He did not appear in the press, did not give interviews, did not make public accusations. He simply followed the legal process, letting the facts speak for themselves. This attitude further confused those involved. They expected confrontation, but found silence. The conflict escalated when the judge in charge of the case requested a preliminary hearing. The possibility of suspension of land use has become real. The mayor feared the political impact. The construction company feared severe financial losses. Future residents feared losing their home before they even moved in. At the hearing, the documents presented by Ethan were irrefutable. The judge recognized the legitimacy of the claim and made it clear that the law was on the side of the original owner. However, he also expressed concern about the social consequences of the case. It wasn't just about roles, but lives about to be affected. Given this, a deadline was granted. No family would be removed, no house demolished, but all parties should seek a viable and just solution. The tension has risen. Now there was a clock ticking. Richard tried a direct approach. He proposed to buy the land for less than the market value, betting that Ethan would prefer to end the conflict quickly. The proposal was refused without hostility, but firmly. It was not about immediate money. From that moment on, the conflict ceased to be only legal and became moral. The city watched. The community waited. And Ethan quietly prepared his next move, aware that any decision he made from then on would define not only his future, but that of dozens of families. The stalemate was formed. With the deadline set by justice, the city entered a state of constant expectation. What was once just a housing project has become the dominant topic in cafes, churches, and community gatherings. Each person involved began to deal with the situation differently, creating subplots that gradually intertwined with the main conflict. Maria Thompson began to feel the weight of uncertainty in everyday life. He continued to work long shifts at the hospital, but now he did so with the constant doubt of where he would be living in the following months. The house she believed she was about to receive had become a fragile promise. Still, she refused to feed resentment. Instead, he became more active in community meetings, arguing that any solution would need to respect both legal right and human dignity. Richard Coleman, meanwhile, was facing mounting pressure from investors. Some demanded quick action, others threatened to withdraw financial support. For the first time in years, Richard had to face the consequences of decisions made with overconfidence. He began reviewing old projects, realizing that this mistake was not an isolated case, but the result of a corporate culture that prioritized speed over accuracy. Inside the town hall, the climate was also deteriorating. Officials were trying to pinpoint where the failure had occurred without exposing specific individuals. There were fears of lawsuits, political attrition, and loss of credibility. The case revealed weaknesses in systems that everyone assumed to be reliable. Meanwhile, Ethan came to be seen not just as a name on documents, but as a real figure. Some people tried direct contact, seeking answers, asking for assurances. He listened more than he talked. At each meeting, he made it clear that he did not want to see anyone harmed, but he also could not give up something that had been built with effort over generations. An unexpected subplot emerged when a group of residents decided to research the history of the land on their own. They discovered that Ethan's father had, years earlier, informally allowed the area to be used for community events and local fairs. That revelation changed the perception of part of the community. The land had never been abandoned. It had just been quietly tended. Time has become a factor of con. Stamp pressure. The expected date for the delivery of the houses was approaching, and no definitive solution had been presented. Each day without response increased the collective anxiety. The media began to approach the case in more depth, giving voice to different perspectives, which broadened the public debate. Despite the increasing complexity, something began to change in the overall tone. The conflict ceased to be seen as a dispute between one man and one community, and came to be understood as a collective failure that required a mature response. This change did not eliminate fear, but opened up space for dialogue. Ethan noticed this movement and understood that the decisive moment was approaching. The subplots, the personal stories, the institutional missteps, the financial pressures, slowly converged on a common ground. The question that hung in the air was no longer just who was right, but what kind of outcome that city would choose to build. The turning point did not happen in a crowded courtroom or on camera, but in a simple meeting held in the city's community center. Representatives of the construction company, members of the city council, community leaders, and some future residents were present. Ethan arrived without announcement, sat quietly, and listened. For hours, arguments were made. Financial spreadsheets, deadlines, legal risks. It all sounded too technical for a problem that had become deeply human. Tension grew as it became clear that none of the proposed solutions suited everyone. Buying the land for a symbolic amount was unfair. Expropriating the homes would be devastating. Prolonging the process would only increase collective suffering. It was then that Ethan asked for the floor. He didn't make a long speech. He didn't accuse anyone. It only presented something that few knew, a little-used clause in state legislation, which allowed land regularization agreements when a systemic error was proven and there was a relevant social impact. He had studied this possibility for months in silence. The proposal was simple in form, but profound in consequences. Ethan would retain legal ownership of the land, as recognized by justice. However, it would grant the community a progressive use and purchase agreement, allowing each family to legally acquire the lot on affordable terms over time. The construction company, in turn, would assume the costs of the settlement and compensate Ethan fairly financially, without passing the damage on to the residents. The room fell silent. The revelation was not only legal, but emotional. For the first time, Everyone understood that Ethan had never sought to beat someone, but to correct a mistake without creating new damage. The narrative changed in that instant. He stopped being seen as a threat and began to be perceived as part of the solution. Richard Coleman was the first to react. He publicly acknowledged the company's failure and accepted the terms. For him, that agreement represented not only a legal way out, but a chance to redefine his own professional stance. The city, pressured by the clarity of the proposal and the growing support of the community, has pledged to speed up bureaucratic processes and ensure full transparency. The community leaders, moved, saw there an opportunity to transform a conflict into collective learning. For future residents, relief was immediate. They wouldn't have to abandon their dreams or carry the guilt for a mistake they didn't make. Security has once again taken the place of uncertainty. The turning point was marked not by applause, but by something more enduring: rebuilt confidence. Ethan left the meeting knowing that he had changed the course of history. Not just by strategy, but by choice. He had honored his father's legacy in a way that made sense at the time. The central conflict was not completely resolved, but the direction had changed. What used to be a rupture was now heading for reconstruction. The decision taken at that meeting began to take effect almost immediately. The tension that hung over the city was gradually replaced by a collective feeling of relief. The works, now officially regularized, were completed with a new sense of purpose. It was no longer just about delivering houses, but about righting a wrong fairly. Richard Coleman publicly took responsibility for the construction company. This attitude, unexpected for many, changed the perception about his company. Investors, initially fearful, began to see value in the transparency adopted. The financial loss did exist, but it was absorbed as part of a necessary correction, not a collapse. The City Hall. RA. Internal processes have been reviewed. Registry systems have undergone audits, and new protocols have been implemented to prevent similar failures from happening again. The case became a state reference in public administration and real estate law courses. For residents, the consequences have been deeply personal. Maria Thompson signed the documents of her allotment with trembling hands, not from fear, but from emotion. For the first time, he felt that the ground beneath his feet truly belonged to him. Their children chose the rooms, and the simple act of hanging curtains took on a special meaning. Ethan, in turn, began to be approached with genuine respect. Not as an idealized hero, but as someone who made a difficult choice with empathy. He remained reserved, but now understood that his decision had created something bigger than a legal settlement. 7. Overcoming and growing Ethan's transformation was visible not in words, but in attitudes. He stopped seeing the land only as a distant heritage and began to engage in a practical way with the community. It created a fund for local improvements, funded in part by the agreement with the construction company, aimed at schools, infrastructure, and common areas. This involvement was neither immediate nor forced. Confidence grew little by little. Invitations popped up. Simple conversations happened. Ethan realized that his relationship with that place had changed, not out of obligation, but out of belonging. For Richard, growth came in the form of professional humility. His company began to prioritize legal rigor and community dialogue in all new projects. The mistake that nearly destroyed her career became the turning point that redefined her. The community also grew. The conflict taught that progress need not trample on rights, and that justice can go hand in hand with compassion. The official opening of the quarter was scheduled for early spring, not as a grand celebration, but as a community gathering. Each house delivered represented not just a home, but a preserved history. In the days leading up to the event, subplots were being shut down, legal proceedings completed, deeds delivered, last adjustments made. Everything converged to a symbolic moment. Ethan was invited to attend the ceremony. He hesitated, but accepted. He knew that this gesture would end a cycle that had begun long before, when his father had told him to guard the earth. On the opening day, residents gathered outdoors. Children ran through the newly named streets. There was simple food, local music, and spontaneous conversations. When Ethan was called forward, there was no immediate applause. There was silence. He did not make a long speech. He only thanked the community for choosing to resolve the conflict with maturity. He said justice, when applied humanely, does not divide, it builds. At that moment, Maria handed him a simple sign, made by the residents. The name of the neighborhood, followed by a short phrase about shared responsibility. That plaque would be installed at the main entrance. The real climax was not a confrontation, but a mutual recognition. Everyone there had changed. Months later, the neighborhood was fully occupied. Gardens flourished. Routines were established. What started as a serious mistake has become an example of a balanced solution. Ethan visited the place occasionally, not as a distant owner, but as someone who had helped shape that space. His father's legacy now made complete sense. The city moved on, more attentive, more responsible. Progress continued, but with awareness. The conflict ended without isolated winners because everyone won something essential. Years later, the neighborhood was cited as a benchmark in fair land deals. The sign at the entrance remained intact, reminding that rights and empathy can coexist when there is courage to act correctly. Stories like this remind us that everyday conflicts don't have to end in destruction. Sometimes the real victory lies in choosing the most difficult path, that of justice with humanity. If this story touched you, reflect. How can your choices impact the lives of others? Share this story and help spread the idea that fair solutions are still possible.